All right, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the Rancher Stewardship Alliance Rural Resilience webinar series. This is our third annual, and we host a free webinar series every month from January through April. And we're so glad you're here. And we're so glad that we have Dr. Megan Van Emon and Dr. Eric Belasco with us tonight. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit about Rancher Stewardship Alliance. So I am Angel DeVries. I am the Executive Director for the Rancher Stewardship Alliance. We are headquartered in Malta, Montana, but we like to share our programming nationwide, and that's part of what we're taking place with tonight. I've dropped quite a few links in the chat in case you're looking for anything specific to learn more about RSA. You can reference those, and I'll drop those again in the chat at the end of tonight's event. So I hope you'll bear with me. I usually play the tech end of things, and I'm usually dropping things in the chat, and someone else is usually hosting, but tonight I get to do both. So please be patient with me as I'm kind of navigating both jobs tonight. So before we get started, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the Rancher Stewardship Alliance. In 2003, with the desire to keep grasslands in the northern Great Plains intact and its producers flourishing, 30 ranching families joined together to form the Rancher Stewardship Alliance. Pressures from outside interests, transition planning, and stressors of ranching in an arid, isolated region were too much to handle alone. A legacy of wise land stewardship is the reason grasslands remain intact. The Rancher Stewardship Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit headquartered in north central Montana with a mission of ranching, conservation, and communities, a winning team. An open, healthy prairie is good for the rancher and good for the wildlife. Recognizing that relationship, the Rancher Stewardship Alliance has been able to create extraordinary partnerships with wildlife groups. And as a direct result, collaborative conservation conversations have replaced those that were previously tense. We're also always learning, which is why we're here tonight, comes into play. This is the second of our 4 in our free Rural Resilience webinar series. Held the third Thursday of January through April, our future discussions will also include grazing with goats and how one Red Lodge ranch producer has turned it into a profitable venture. And lastly, seeing the impact that you are having on your own land by using photo monitoring. We also have one more final shameless plug for the future of RSA programming. Our organization, in partnership with the Win It Aces, which is our sister group south of the Missouri River, are bringing you a glimpse of 3 family stories. Our events are taking place Monday, February 20th and Tuesday, February 21st. Monday, February 20th is in Malta and Tuesday is in Win It. These 2 identical evenings will include dinner, thought-provoking discussion, and interactive conversations surrounding the importance of agricultural operations succession planning for the preservation of family farms and ranches. So I hope you'll join us. You can find the link to register there if you're interested in attending. Details for all these events can be found on our website, ranchstewards.org/events, and at the links I've dropped in the chat. As we get ready to welcome in tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind you that this is an interactive event. About halfway through our night tonight, we'll have an opportunity to break into smaller groups and discuss a question that Dr. Belasco and Megan Van Emon has posed to us. So now we're going to go into our main event. Tonight, we're going to have Dr. Eric Belasco talk first, and then we'll move into Megan, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce both of them now. So join us, and we're going to welcome Dr. Eric Belasco, who is a professor of agricultural economics at Montana State University, go Cats, where he teaches courses in agricultural policy, financial engineering, and agricultural marketing. Belasco currently serves as an associate editor for the American Journal of Agricultural Economics and the Agricultural Finance Review, and is a former president of the Western Agricultural Economics Association. And Dr. Megan Van Emon has been an extension beef cattle specialist at Montana State University since 2014. Her research focuses on supplementation strategies, cow-calf production, drought management, and water quality. Dr. Van Emon's research and extension program focus on improving beef cattle production in Montana and throughout the United States. Dr. Van Emon grew up on a small farm in northeast Indiana, and Megan is currently located off MSU campus at USDA ARS Fort Keogh in Miles City. So thank you everyone for joining us again tonight. Be sure as you're listening to the presenters, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll use them for our Q&A session at the end of the event, at the end of tonight's event. If you're just joining us, please let us know where you're joining from. It's always fun to see. And right now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Eric. So it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much for that very nice introduction. And as I'm getting my slides open here, I'll just mention that you know, what this organization does is great. We, my boys and I, we were just talking before, spend a lot of time around Phillips County chasing wildlife and trying to add to our freezer. So, you know, I'm always paying attention to the drought conditions because of that, even though I'm not in the cattle business directly, like many of you are. You know, I'm definitely paying attention to that drought. So what I want to start by talking about is just kind of the basic economics of where we are, and then look forward to hearing what Dr. Van Emon has to say about more on the range ecology side. So the title, you know, and this has kind of been a working title really for like the last year across Montana. And it's kind of some iteration. It's really just, you know, where do we kind of figure out, you know, where cattle inventory should be and how do we respond to drought? And so I'll talk about a few different things. First, just to kind of put the current and sort of past drought, depending upon where you are, into context. And, you know, one of the real big safety net programs that we've been talking about, especially over the last couple of years, and has grown by quite a bit, are some of these insurance programs. So the importance of that, just having some cash on hand to rebuild, you know, when you're able to, a lot of these safety net programs do provide that. So I'll talk through some of those, and then just, you know, as economists, as ag economists, how do we think about these rebuilding decisions and kind of what goes into them? So first, just to get started, you know, and to kind of put it into context, you know, really since the mid, 1970s, you know, Montana, like many other parts of the U.S., has seen a reduction in inventory. The average has been about 0.5% a year, just to put that into context. And so the 10% drop in 2022 was really large and really hit a wide swath of Montana. Really hadn't seen it in at least 30 years, a drop that significant. And so, you know, when we see those drops, we think of, you know, the reductions to supplies, hopefully increasing some of your local demand for those who do have grass and who do have, you know, calves and are able to sell, perhaps seeing a price premium. And we haven't really seen that this year either. And, you know, so I think a lot of us were hoping for some recovery following that drought in 2022. And we saw some, you know, it was still a drop at 2%, and it's really been regionalized. I haven't seen the regional breakdown yet, but my guess is that it's really focused on Phillips County has been one of the areas that where the drought has still remained, while, you know, other parts, especially closer to Bozeman, you know, we've seen more, you know, some good, you know, rainfall and snowfall to kind of get us back to more normal levels. But a 2% drop, you know, at the beginning of 2023, kind of, again, you know, it isn't as bad as 10% drop, but, you know, still below kind of the average. So, you know, at some point, you know, we're kind of looking to rebuild. And so I think that's kind of the question that I just hear people talking about a lot, is thinking about the economics of those decisions. And so just looking at kind of where, you know, we saw some of these reductions, obviously Montana, you know, 250,000 head. You know, we saw our neighbors, the Dakotas to the east, you know, so with some reductions, Texas, overall about a 2% drop. And so here, you know, for 2023, we've actually seen a larger decrease in inventories nationally. So almost 3%, you know, 2.6 million head. You know, well below kind of the trend that we've seen since the mid 70s. And a lot of this is going to be in the Southern Plains area. I note Oklahoma there, 12% reduction, 600,000 head. And the Dakotas feeling it again, you know, this year. Montana, you know, about a 2%, you know, 40,000 head reduction off of last year. And so going back to kind of that earlier year, just to kind of pinpoint, you know, Phillips County, Fergus County, really were kind of where we saw a lot of those reductions. And I think the way we get to those large numbers for the state being 10%, you look at these big counties, Yellowstone County, Beaverhead County, Phillips County, Fergus County, these are all really big cattle production, areas where we've seen significant reductions. So that's kind of where we get to that 10% figure. And the one thing that we see, from economics, every time we see a drought is the price of hay goes up as those supplies are reduced. I've heard stories about it being shipped, further and further coming in from, as far as the Midwest into some areas, and still not quite recovered. I mean, eventually you would see these prices increase and then kind of decrease. But here, in terms of real, so we're getting rid of inflation. This is accounting for that inflationary impact. Really, we're seeing some of the highest hay prices in 30 years, and they've continued to increase. And so, which tells me that the supplies just have not, caught up to the demand. And so if we look at the average, from 1990 to 2022, the real price is about $146 a ton, and we're still at $236. So we're almost, double what kind of the average, 30-year price is. And so, quite a bit higher. If we look at kind of the seasonality and what's happened over time, it is still higher, but it has at least stopped increasing. You probably heard that, like when they talk about inflation. Well, it's not increasing, but that doesn't mean prices are coming down. It just means they're not going up anymore. And that's kind of where we are with hay. They've kind of flattened out. And so we've kind of seen, these prices around, 240, 250, really for about a year now. And they've kind of leveled off. And we would expect that if, the supplies continue to meet that demand, that price would fall back to more normal levels, what we experienced really in like 2020 and 2019. And, the flip side, we look at real calf prices, we haven't seen a whole lot of premium there, right? So you have all these higher input costs, but, real calf prices and really, any sector, any part of the supply chain you look at, real prices are basically in line with the long-term averages. So there's nothing extraordinary about cattle prices, and a lot of the gains that you see kind of on the consumer side is, really on the logistics, the marketing, all of those expenses that really go toward the end of the supply chain, not really at the beginning of the supply chain. So a lot of, additional costs, coming in with not too much of a premium gain, although, it could be worse, right? Prices could be, that's the number one thing that'll get us in trouble is when prices really drop, and prices have remained fairly stable. Again, even controlling for some of those inflationary pressures. So, what can we do? And one of the big things, that I like to focus on is buying insurance. So I'm a professor at MSU. Someone like me, you tend to call me risk averse. I tend to avoid risk, and so thinking about insurance is a good way to offset some of those. And really, I think the other way to think of it is it really will prepare you for when the market turns, you're ready to go. And so two programs, one in particular, the pasture rangeland forage product, many of you are probably already familiar with it. So I won't talk about too much of the details of that, but basically, you buy this insurance. It's a rainfall index, but you buy the insurance ahead of time. And then, if you get lower than normal rainfall, it pays out an indemnity. What we'll see is that the payments are pretty large under this program. And so if you're, suffering from drought, what they can do is they can provide some cash for when you do have grass and you're ready to rebuild, you have that cash on hand ready to go. The other program, which doesn't pay as good, but is also there, is the livestock forage protection program sold by the FSA. So just to kind of illustrate, and again, this is kind of what I focus on. So if you ever have a question about crop insurance or, livestock insurance, please let me know. So loss ratios are one of the things that I pay attention to, because that tells you if you're buying this insurance policy, it's how much money you're getting back relative to what you're putting in. And so if it's above 1, you can see the 1 line is fairly low down there. That means that on average for the state, for the premiums that people have put in, they've gotten those back in terms of indemnities. One thing we've seen over the last 3 years is that this program has had loss ratios over 2, meaning that for every dollar you're paying in premiums, you're getting back at least $2 in indemnities. So again, we've had, miserable weather over the last few years, so it shouldn't surprise any of us that would be the case. And in fact, in 2021, we even saw a loss ratio of 3. And so, again, $3 in indemnity payments for $1 a premium. And, the way that I look at it is what this does is it, obviously you're making these decisions during drought, perhaps to reduce herd, things like that. But then when, the grass comes back, or when when you have adequate supplies of hay and you're able to keep, a big enough herd, then you have the cash on hand to do that. So high loss ratios really over the last 3 years. The other thing, and this chart, I think is, it's kind of eye-popping to me, honestly, but you look at the participation here, like Montana ranchers are getting it. And I might be talking like I'm a salesman. I'm not a salesman. I don't get anything for insurance. But I do think it's worth considering. But you see the participation in terms of liability has really gone, it averaged around, $25 million, really, since it started. And then over the last few years, it's really jumped over 100 million this last year in coverage. So big participation gains in this program. The other one, like I said, the livestock disaster programs are also available. Livestock forage payments are a little smaller, but on the other hand, like you're not paying a premium. So, I don't think of this as much as an insurance policy, because really you don't have to pay a premium. You don't have to sign up ahead of time. It's really signing up afterwards. So just to kind of put all this into perspective and kind of close out, what do we think about when we're rebuilding? And one of the issues that, that ranchers have is just managing high revenue levels. If you're selling, your herd down to a smaller size, you're going to have those inventory sales. You might have insurance disaster aid payments. Again, you have all these high revenue levels. And what you really like to do is reinvest that revenue perhaps into, increase your herd size. But it's just not there, right? The grass is not there. And so, I've talked before, to some folks in Phillips County about the involuntary conversion. And I know Marco's told you guys all about that. So I won't get too much into that. But really those things are just meant to kind of, maintain a high revenue level so that you're ready to go when the market turns in your favor. As far as economic decisions, so if any of you come through our Ag Biz program, the things that we look at first, if you're growing hay, the opportunity cost of using it as feed is obviously selling it. And when it's selling for, $250 a ton, that opportunity cost is pretty high to use it as feed. Thinking about maintaining your herd size, not only thinking about kind of what you can sell them for now, but your present value of all those future revenues that you'll get from that animal. So a lot of times we think of it as like, do you cut down the tree now, or do you let it grow and cut it down later? It's a very similar issue there. So just thinking about kind of the long term, because these selling decisions a lot of times have, as many of you know, have long-term ramifications. It takes a long time to rebuild. And so just to kind of conclude here, there are some tools, at least for preparing for drought. Like I said, maintaining solid cash flows is definitely one way. That doesn't, make grass grow, magically though. So you're not getting that, but it does, get you prepared for when, things are, when the rain does come. It allows for a quicker rebuilding. In fact, a lot of the, people that I've talked to who invest heavily in PRF, as soon as they have the grass, like they're really buying cattle. to rebuild some of those herds. So that's a nice opportunity. The other thing, that we've been talking about a lot at MSU is, flexible stocking rates, some of these critical decision points where you're thinking about, okay, now's the time. Do I reduce the herd, put less stress on my field? One of the best resources that I've found out there is the GrassCast productivity forecasts out there. And there's a link there through the Northern Plains Climate Hub that they produce that, which I think is a great resource just to, make some of those decisions as well. So I'll stop there and not go over time like most professors at MSU do, and hopefully look forward to some questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Belasco. Megan, if you're ready, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Eric, when you get a chance, you can go ahead and stop your screen share. Very good. Thank you. Megan, if you're ready, it's all on you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me tonight. I do know a few of the folks on the call tonight. So honestly, Eric kind of touched on some of the information I was going to touch on. But basically he touched on it a little more detail than me just saying, yeah, check out those FSA programs and some things like that. But one of the big things, since he covered a lot of the reduction in cattle numbers over the last few years, I won't go into that in too much detail, but it is interesting. And I did check out the most updated and most recent seasonal drought outlook today, as well as the Montana Drought Monitor. And I guess, fortunately, unfortunately, maybe for you guys up in the Malta area and kind of that north central part of the state, you are still in a D3 drought, but it is now less than 4% of the state compared to a couple of weeks ago when we were upwards of 10 to 15% still. But most of the state, 95%, is still in the drought, except for the very far southeast corner, which has seen quite a few of those snowstorms come through in the Ekalaka, Alzada, Broadus areas. Those last few larger snowstorms that primarily missed a lot of Montana, except for maybe the western part of the state, and it kind of swung back down through. So one of the big things, I guess, I just have kind of some general things I want to discuss tonight, or maybe just some things to think about as you're considering buying some cows back or retaining some more heifers. Obviously, cost is probably your biggest concern, but the number one is, if you have downsized your herd in the last couple of years, having that plan moving forward, specific goals in mind of your herd and what cows you're going to purchase to help you meet those goals. That's the most important. So when you go to the sales yard, or maybe the neighbor down the road or something has some heifers for sale that you're looking at. But big one I do want to touch on here is knowing the carrying capacity of your ranch, whether it's a drought year or just an average year. I know in the Miles City area, I was asking some of our range folks at USDA kind of what the average is, because they do these measurements every year on Fort Keogh and all over the station. But average production for our grasslands, at least in Miles City area, are about 1,200 pounds per acre, which isn't a whole lot when you consider maybe you're doing a take half, leave half type of operation or management of those rangelands. So when we're calculating how many cattle we can have on those pastures, looking at our animal unit months, or AUMs, and so those stocking rates, and just remembering that all of our stocking rates are based on 1,000-pound cow. And the last I checked, national average for cow size was 1,350. And so we're, having to consider, instead of a 1.0 for that 1,000-pound cow and animal unit months, we're having to consider a 1.4. So remembering that those bigger cows takes more feed for maintenance. And I just ran through a few numbers, but, on a 1,000-pound cow for a year, eating roughly about 9,000 pounds of forage versus that 1,400-pound cow eating about a little over 12,000 pounds. So making sure that our pastures have the capability to carry the number of animals that are going to be on the operation, whether drought year or average year. And when I did look at the seasonal drought outlook, unfortunately, there are some areas that are saying that the drought's supposed to dissipate. But in that Malta area, north central Montana, they are saying it does still persist, but hopefully these last snows have added some water into the reservoirs. Because in visiting with Marco up there, who just now retired as the Phillips County Extension agent, but a lot of those folks on the High Line, it wasn't necessarily the forage they couldn't overcome in the pastures, it was the lack of water and having to haul water, and that's a labor, that's extra money, that's gas, anything to have to haul that. So those are some major considerations when rebuilding these herds. So one of the big ones, like I said, have a plan, know all your resources, pasture, inventory, any sort of harvested feeds, grains. One of the big things we ran into during the drought was, well, we can't get all these feeds that we maybe could have in the past, or they became very expensive, as Eric demonstrated there with our hay prices. And I know a lot of folks were paying upwards of $300 to $350 a ton hay the last few years because they had to truck it from, states away, unfortunately. And I do know, at least I know that was the big concern. We had a pretty good hay year in a lot of the state because we got some timely rains, and then nobody wanted to sell hay to anybody else. So that's the unfortunate, we had a really good hay year in 2019. We sold a lot of hay, didn't keep probably as much back as we should for that potential drought scenario. And now they ran out of hay, and now they're hoarding it all again to help build up those stockpiles. So just something to consider on why maybe we didn't have a lot of hay available in the state to move around. And with that plan, having a business plan, and that's something to sit down with your financial advisors and your bankers and figure out how you're going to pay for some of these things, such as buying more cattle, or if you had to destock, how you're going to effectively use that money for tax purposes and all of those implications. Next would be have a team. Who's a part of your team, and that includes you, yourself, and your skills, as well as then anybody else you have to hire in. Added labor, family members, veterinarians, things like that, knowing what everybody's expertise is and how they're going to fit into that operation effectively as well as efficiently. One thing to keep in mind, a lot of what I know they're doing a succession planning here coming up next week, I think was the date. But just when you're working with family, you're thinking, oh, I work with family, it's great. We don't have to have some of these things written down or leases or, I always recommend having some sort of written agreement so everybody knows what their responsibilities are, family included. That way nothing, gets put by the wayside, or who's responsible for fencing, things like that, for all those financial things. Then how do we measure the progress of the herd we have and how we're going to measure progress in the future? And that's by keeping records. Doesn't have to be super fancy. It can be a piece of paper where you write down where everybody calves. That's kind of the big one. You don't know how far you've gone if you don't know where you started. So I'm a big person of record keeping. And I know we have some resources on the Beef Extension website, which I forgot to give to Angel there, but it happens. But you can always just Google that. But also, when you're making those herd decisions, whether it is the herd you have currently and what you're going to destock, but also what you're looking to purchase, because you want those similar genetics. You know your management style. You know the environment your cattle are in. So selecting cattle to buy or retain that fit that management style is extremely important. And one of the things like Eric touched on is just having that plan also when the next drought occurs, right? It's not like we're never going to have a drought again. So you've gone through, now we've had we had a flash drought in 17. I always get now, and everything for me now is pre-COVID, post-COVID, and pre-COVID just kind of all runs together, and all the years of COVID run together, and then now we're kind of beyond it. So, and then now we've had a multi-year drought. So what sort of things did you take away from that, and how to better prepare in the future, or when you're going to make some of these financial decisions, destocking decisions, range management decisions? And then kind of the last one, when you're considering that herd expansion, one of the big ones is retaining your heifers or more heifers than you would on average versus purchasing heifers, right? Because when you purchased heifers, you may not know the background as much, but you also did not have to accept all the risk. Because most likely you bought them, that maybe they're already bred, you know what bulls they're bred to, you know, you're limiting some of that risk, but you're probably going to spend a little bit of a premium on knowing that information. And how does that compare to retaining heifer calves in the fall, raising them, breeding them to whatever bull you decide, and feeding them that extended period of time, and how you're going to have to sit down and kind of do some cost analysis on that. And that's where the resources like Eric presented, as well as some of the resources he and Kate Fuller have developed for the extension side of the things, can really come into play. As well as then knowing what your input costs are, what kind of feed you have available, can help you determine how many cattle you can purchase effectively without having to go out and spend a lot of extra money on any sort of purchased feeds. And then, you know, what is that genetic merit of those cattle you're purchasing versus retaining, right? When we're retaining those heifers, they're our youngest, they're our best. That's the herd we want to see in 5 to 6 years. And do the purchased heifers match up to that? Or maybe you decide to move in a new direction for your herd because you had to destock. Like Eric said, we don't have a lot of risk in the business because we are not ranchers. You know, we can give you all the resources we can and answer the questions. But these are the really hard decisions you as producers have to sit down and make, that will provide the resources as maybe some of the knowledge. But at the end of the day, you have to decide which cattle you're going to cull and which you're going to keep. Because like Eric said, the last few years have been kind of Debbie Downer talks. Honestly, you know, it's like, well, we don't have any feed, we don't have any pasture, we don't have any water. You should probably think about destocking or selling some of those cattle. And I always like to talk about Bessie. You know, she's the 1,800 pounder out there. You've had her, she's probably like 12 years old. She has a calf. She weighs 350, the calf weighs 350 pounds at weaning time, but she's your favorite cow. She's your grandkid's favorite cow, or your kid's favorite cow, because, you know, she comes up and finds you in the pasture. She's super sweet. But this was the hard decision that you had to make probably the last few years, of maybe having to get rid of some of those Bessie cows that you really, really loved. And maybe they were the first original parts of the herd. And those are the hard decisions you have to make the last couple of years. That's kind of all I had just to run through. I'm kind of just more interested, you know, what comes out of the breakout sessions and hearing some of the questions and things like that, and maybe some experiences that we've all had.
Well, thank you, Megan. I appreciate that. So if you don't remember, this is an interactive event, which means we're going to take just a few minutes, probably around 7 or 8 minutes, to break out into some breakout rooms. At this time, I'd really encourage you, this is our chance for some peer-to-peer learning, and we may be in different areas, and we do all have very different situations, but I think we can learn a lot from just sitting, you know, in a virtual table with people who are in the same situation as us. So I really encourage you to, when we move into these breakout rooms, introduce yourself, say maybe where your operation is located, maybe share a little bit about what your herd size or acreage or something looks like. And then we're going to go into the breakout question, which tonight, that breakout question, thank you, Megan, is what is your number one factor that you look at number one factor that you look at for when looking for cattle to add or retain to your herd? And maybe you want to share 2 or 3 factors. Maybe you kind of have a well-rounded decision-making process, or maybe you don't have one at all, but this is our chance to learn. So we are going to go ahead and move into our breakout sessions right now. I'm going to hit the button and it's going to zoom you out into rooms with some other friends. So introduce yourself. We're going to take about 7 or 8 minutes to do this. So enjoy your time. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a few people that maybe you've never met before and learn a little bit more about each other. As we wait for everyone to come back into the main session, if there were some key things that you learned, or just some wow moments, or just anything from your conversation with people in your group, please drop those in the chat. Just make a few comments about what you guys discussed. What were some of those key factors when you're looking at adding cattle to the herd or retaining within your herd? So that was the question that Megan posed to us. Hopefully you guys got to learn a lot from each other. Also, if you have any other questions, at this point, we're going to start moving into our Q&A session. So if you have other questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat too. I'm monitoring that, so I'll see those and I'll direct those accordingly. I'll just wait until everybody gets pulled back in here. I think we're just about done. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm not seeing any key discussion topics yet in the chat, but I do know that I have a few questions. I'm going to qualify this with, I am an accountant. I am not a nutritional specialist. I am not an animal scientist. I am none of those things, but I know what I do know is from talking and having great conversations with producers through my job. So there was some key things that I wanted to talk about and some, discussions that regarding this drought and, economic trends and things that we're considering. So I'm going to go ahead and pose this question to Megan and Eric. The first question is, what are some of the key tasks and considerations for preparing for our next drought? That's mostly aimed at Megan. And then kind of just as a question B to that, more directed at Eric, what are, from an economic standpoint, are there trends that we might notice leading up to a drought or specifically after a drought that we should be aware of? And how do we look at those trends to make considerations and decisions on our ranch? So Megan, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. What should we do to prepare for that next drought? That's a loaded question, I know, but take a stab at it.
Yeah, that's the thing, is it's so dependent on each operation and what your goals are. To be better prepared for that next drought. But we've now gone through a flash drought of 2017 into one of the worst winters in, 50 years or however many years, and then we come into the multi-year drought of kind of 21 through now, really. And I think the key things you kind of really need to consider on an operation basis or individually or however you want to put it, just what did you do now? Make a list of everything you've done to help mitigate the risk that you had with the drought, because we're all about lowering the risk potential. That's kind of the key factor. And maybe some things you would have done differently or made decisions sooner. As we were talking about in kind of while you guys were in the breakout session, was having maybe some key dates or at least key factors like percentage of precipitation versus average by a certain month or a certain time frame, and deciding and writing that down of saying, well, I know now that if we don't receive X number of inches of rain by January 15th or inches of snow or precipitation, I know I can't hold on to all my replacement heifers, or I need to really start considering to break down the herd and what core herd I want to maintain versus selling out. So that's kind of one of those things I guess I would consider. It's like she said, it's a loaded question. It's so dependent. But that's one of the things, like I said, I'm all about record keeping. So the decisions you made, and are there decisions you might have made differently or earlier or sooner? Because we came into 21 and we thought, hey, it's just a year, we'll get through it, we'll be fine. And then we couldn't weather that storm because it just persisted. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Eric for the second part.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, good question. Droughts are really hard to predict. I would not try to be in the business of predicting droughts. I would just say try to prepare for them. When the weather is good. On the flip side, though, there are some things that you can see as you come out of drought. For example, and there was a comment there, how do you restock when cattle are overpriced? That's exactly the thing that happens, right? Because drought happens, hay prices go up because the supplies are down. Cattle are moved out of state because, you can't, your stocking rates are going down, and a lot of them need to go where there is grass, or they get sold at an earlier age, perhaps. But then, when it comes time to buy, everyone's, looking to buy. What happens when everyone's looking to buy is that, those prices go up. And so, it can be a tough situation because, if you're typical, I mean, in any market, this isn't just a cattle market, but if you're reacting in the same way that the majority of the market is, you are going to, try to be buying something when prices are high, because that's when the, demand for such things are moving up. The converse is true as well. During a drought, when prices are low and everyone's trying to sell, those prices aren't going to be as good as what you'd like them to be, because, the supply is dropping, and that's going to be bringing down price. And so, as you come out of drought, I guess those are kind of the things that I would look for. Generally you try to be kind of counter cyclical in what you're doing. So, if you have prepared for drought, whether it's a conservation practice you've put into place, you're doing some grazing practice that maybe retains a little soil moisture in a dry year. If you're able to do things like that, then you can put yourself in a position where, perhaps you're able to sell cattle when people are ready, looking to buy it, as opposed to, kind of acting along with the market.
Well, thanks, Eric. I just kind of pondering both of your thoughts there. One thing I've heard in a lot of these drought discussions is, what are the two things you want to have in a drought? And one is cash, and two is hay or forage, right? And what's the one thing you don't want in a drought? Is livestock or cattle, because you don't have the hay to give them. And that's an oversimplified, viewpoint of drought management, and it's easier said than done. But I heard someone say that, and I just thought, oh, it's a little bit of a punch to the gut, but also a really good realization that when you're considering how to prepare for the next drought, is maybe that balance between having the hay but not too much cows, too many cattle to balance that. So and thank you for your guys' time. I think one other question I kind of want to pose to the whole group, thinking back to Eric, when you were talking about the pasture rangeland and forage insurance, if any of you have that, or if you did have it and you turned it in, I would love to see in the chat if you guys have utilized it. I don't know how common it is especially in our area. A few months back, we did a drought live webinar, and it included Dale Viseth, who's one of our board members. And I know he has that. And of course, there's different types of insurances that monitor, at least in my limited experience, that measure the different rainfall and how they pay out. But I'd be really curious to know if anyone in our audience utilizes that insurance, and if you found it was valuable at all. And Eric, if you want to talk more about that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that insurance works, and if that's obviously you said you're not getting a cut for the insurance, but you're a good proponent because it just mitigates that risk. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and if you've heard from producers who've utilized it.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate. I do not sell insurance. I do not make money on insurance. But it has really gained in popularity, particularly because of the drought. You've seen a lot more purchases of PRF. The other one that's come about recently is livestock risk protection, which you can buy to manage price risk. And so a lot of these things for a long time, crop producers really were the only ones that were buying insurance in Montana and really across the US. But in the last few years, there's really been a big surge in participation by ranchers. And, that's exactly what these products are meant for. They're subsidized so that, you're generally not going to lose money over the long run. So if you think of utilizing them as like an insurance to kind of protect against a bad drought, bad cattle prices, over the long run, in a given year, you might pay out your premium and you might not collect. And that's a good year, right? Whenever you pay your insurance premiums and you're not collecting anything, that's a good year. But if it's a bad year, then you at least have that backstop. And one of the nice things is that it is subsidized so that you're not losing money like, on most of your other insurance programs that you'll buy into. So yeah, that's all I'll say without getting into like the mechanics of like exactly how they work. But I'll tell you what, if you want to learn more about how they work, shoot me an email. I'd love to talk to you about that more.
Well, thank you, Eric. I really appreciate that insight. We had a couple comments, a couple producers here tonight say that they have utilized those insurance policies and they've had good luck with it. So that's really encouraging to hear, especially for those producers who maybe have never considered it before. Or, you know, I also think I have a heart for the financial, like, tight, you know, budgets. And when you consider if your budgets are tight, that may be one of the first things that you get rid of, but maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe that should move up higher on the priority list when we think about our expenses in our operations. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we're going to conclude for the night. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And Megan and Eric, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your insight and sharing all of your knowledge. And then I'm going to give one more final plug. We've got our Succession Stories event happening Monday in Malta and Tuesday in Winnett. If you would like to register, please join us. It's just a suggested donation of $35, but if you can't pay that, please come anyways. We're just really trying to focus on sharing stories about farm succession and how people have navigated that really difficult process. I'd also ask that you fill out our post-event survey. I'm dropping that link as well. That survey is super helpful for us as we continue to do our educational programming moving forward. So please take a look at that. Please fill it out. We'll also be sending up a follow-up email that will include the recording of this as well as that survey again. But if you could fill it out right now while it's fresh in your mind, we'd sure appreciate that. And then I'm just going to one more time drop the links that we had started that we had at the beginning of tonight. So thank you to everyone who joined us and have a great night tonight.